Hypnotic Specter. It was once one of the most feared creatures in all of Magic the Gathering. It was not only an incredibly efficient creature for the time, it was also highly disruptive. For 1 generic and 2 black, it's a 2/2 with flying, and when it deals combat damage to your opponent, they discard a card at random. While the Spectre certainly doesn't look like a bad card today, it's nowhere near the powerhouse it once was. So, that begs the question, how good was Hypnotic Specter, actually? Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and this is the 3rd episode of a new series I'm trying out this May, one that might replace one of my MTG top 10s each week if the videos do well enough. This is a series where I'm taking a deep dive into a single card and discussing its competitive history. So far, I've looked at Serra Angel, Mog Fanatic, and Icy Manipulator, so check those videos out if you haven't already. Also, if you're interested in seeing more of this series, liking and sharing this video goes a long way towards making that happen. Next week will be the last edition of this initial offering of the series, and after that video I'll have to decide whether I'll be moving forward with it. So if you like this series, make sure to let me know. As usual, I ran a poll to let viewers decide the topic of this video, and this time I pitted 2 of the best creatures from the 1990s against one another, Urnam Djinn and Hypnotic Specter. In the end, Hypnotic Specter won in a landslide. In fact, it defeated the Djinn by an even wider margin than Serra Angel did a few weeks back. So let's answer the question that so many of you want to know. How good was Hypnotic Specter, actually? Hypnotic Specter is as old as the game of Magic itself. In other words, it was in Magic's debut set, Limited Edition Alpha, which came out in 1993. However, unlike some of the other cards we've covered in this series, like Serra Angel and Icy Manipulator, Hypnotic Specter wasn't a significant part of the competitive metagame at Magic's first World Championship in 1994. In fact, not a single copy of it appeared in any of the top decks. In general, Black was underrepresented at the 1994 World Championship, with the color barely making an impact. It only appeared in 2 of the top 4 decks, and it was just used to splash Demonic Tutor and Mind Twist. The decks at Worlds in 1994 had access to tons of crazy fast mana and absurdly strong cards like the Power 9, and Black wasn't really a color you needed to go into to have busted starts to the game. Every single deck had access to free mana rocks and Black Lotus after all. However, competitive Magic changed a lot between Worlds 1994 and Worlds in 1995. The biggest change was that the game was divided into 2 formats, Type 2 and Type 1, which were the precursors to Standard and Vintage respectively. Type 2 became the more prominent competitive format, and it was significantly powered down. The biggest difference was that the Power 9 and other fast mana was entirely banned out of the format instead of just restricted. So, when Worlds rolled around in 1995, decks weren't packing nearly as much power. And that next year at Worlds, a predominantly black deck won the whole thing. Alexander Blumke's deck was a rack control deck. In other words, it was a deck that looked to disrupt the opponent's entire game plan with discard effects and use the rack to take advantage of all the black discard effects, since it would quickly start to damage the opponent. Hypnotic Specter was now, of course, one of those effects. So what suddenly made black one of the more powerful colors? Well, the biggest reason for the shift was that Black still had access to absurd fast mana that other colors didn't have anymore, and that was thanks to Dark Ritual. The Ritual let you spend 1 mana to get back 3 black mana, and that meant black decks could do way more powerful things in the early game than any other color. One of the most powerful plays they could pull off? Dark Ritual into Hypnotic Specter on turn 1. If your opponent couldn't answer that, the Spectre would quickly rip apart their hand while inflicting tons of damage. The deck had a critical mass of random discard too. Hymn to Turok and Mind Twist were also pretty powerful on turn 1 following a Ritual. Hymn to Turok didn't get printed until a few months after Worlds in 1994, and it was certainly another factor in powering up Black in the time between the 2 World Championships. So, after going seriously underplayed at Worlds in 1994, Black had become the color with the best fast mana, and it had an identity as a disruptive color that could flush the opponent's game plan down the toilet in the extreme early game with random discard effects, making it very hard for other players to defend themselves. And for the next few years, Black would be all about doing powerful stuff with Dark Ritual on turn 1, and it and Hypnotic Specter were joined at the hip. In late 1995, Black gained another new advantage when one of the most powerful Black cards of all time was printed, Ice Age's Necropotence. This enchantment allows you to pay life to exile cards from the top of your library, and then you get them all in your hand at the beginning of your next end step. Basically, you can draw cards equal to your life total if you feel like it. What's more is, you could get this down on turn 1 with Dark Ritual. It took Necropotence a little while to catch on, between being famously underrated and the presence of Black Vice in Standard, a card that punished you for having too many cards in your hand. But the Vice got restricted in early 1996, and people came to know the true power of Necropotence, and Hypnotic Specter was very much a beneficiary of that. Hypnotic Specter went from being a card no one played at Worlds in 1994 to being the most heavily played creature in Standard in 1996. It achieved 2 top 8s at the game's first Pro Tour, which occurred in New York in February of 1996. Leon Lindbeck top 8'd the event with a mono black deck, and it marked the first time someone top 8'd a major event with Necropotence. Up until this point, people still weren't that sure about the card. There was another black deck in the top 8 at the event, and it didn't run a single Necropotence. But Leon knew what he was doing. His deck would get the game started quickly, with an early Hypnotic Specter or Order of the Ebb in hand, but if that wasn't enough, he could also draw tons and tons of cards with Necropotence, and alongside Drain Life, there wasn't much of a limit on just how many cards he could draw. Turn 1 Hypnotic Specter was no longer the best thing you could do with a ritual, but it still remained very much a part of the Necropotence decks that would emerge in the coming months. Because now, the secret was out. Necropotence was insanely strong, and by the summer of that year, the 4 pillars of all black decks was Dark Ritual, Necropotence, Hymn to Turok, and Hypnotic Specter. Decks with this core were so dominant that players refer to the time as Black Summer, because virtually every deck that top 8'd major events was black. This resulted in a format where all the decks were either mono black or designed to combat these mono black decks. For example, at Worlds in 1996, 4 of the top 8 decks were packing Hypnotic Specter, but the deck that won it all, that was Tom Chan Feng's White Weenie deck, which had no fewer than 12 creatures with protection from black. The format would play out similarly at Nationals and Worlds in 1996 and Pro Tour Dallas too. However, 1996 would also mark the end of Hypnotic Specter's success for quite some time. This is because it rotated out of Standard. This was very much welcome, as that, combined with a ban for Hymn to Turok, put an end to Black Summer. Kind of like what we saw with Sarah Angel, Wizards of the Coast now knew that the Spectre was too good for Standard, and they chose not to reprint it for quite some time. However, in July 1997, it looked like Hypnotic Specter got some good news with the creation of the Extended format. This was a rotating format that featured the last several years of cards, and a similar ban list to Type 1. Hypnotic Specter was only legal in the format very briefly though. As it became clear, it made the black decks too good. So while Necropotence decks continue to find success in this new format, Hypnotic Specter didn't get to go along for the ride this time. It remained banned and extended until 4th edition rotated out of the format, and it was never really given a chance. So Hypnotic Specter would have to wait a long time before finding another chance to see play in Standard or Extended. And it would next find success in another new-ish format. Legacy, as we think of it today, started to take shape in 2004. This is when the format was more clearly delineated from Vintage. And in 2005, the format started to get Grand Prix. And at the first of these, Grand Prix Philadelphia in 2005, Hypnotic Specter was back to his old tricks alongside his running mates Dark Ritual and Hymn to Turok. While the Spectre never quite caught on in a huge way in Legacy, it did achieve a handful of top 8s between 2005 and 2009 in the format, and always alongside Dark Ritual and Hymn. In 2005, not long after the Spectre started to see play in Legacy, it finally got to see the light of day in Standard and Extended again, thanks to a reprint in 9th edition. Over the years, creatures had gradually gotten better, so the Spectre was no longer viewed as nearly as problematic, plus Dark Ritual wasn't part of the format either. Now, the earliest you could get the Spectre down was on turn 2, with the help of a Mana Dork. Still, even without Dark Ritual, the Spectre was still good enough to see lots of play in Standard, and it first broke into the format in a pretty familiar looking deck. At Canadian Nationals in 2005, the Specter was played in a discard-heavy black-green deck that claimed 6 of the top 8 slots at the event. The Specter was supported by creatures like ravenous rats and chittering rats, which could also go after the opponent's hand, and while the rack wasn't available in the format, the deck did use Nezumi's Shortfang, a creature that could force a discard with its activated ability, and if your opponent ran out of cards, it flipped into a creature with a rack-like effect. Umezawa's Jite was also a dominant card in this format standard, so there was extra value in having an evasive creature like the Specter, who could very easily rack up charge counters on the Jite. The Specter's success wasn't limited to regional events either. It also found itself in the top 8 of the year's biggest event, the 2005 World Championship, where it was played as a full 4 of in a bug mid-range deck. The Specter continued to figure into Standard going into 2006 and 2007 too. In 2006 at Pro Tour Honolulu, it was played in an Orzhov aggro deck. Once again, this deck packed lots of disruptive creatures. Joining Ravenous Rats and the Specter was Shrieking Grotesque. So as we've continued to see, getting a creature that can disrupt the opponent's game plan was a good strategy, and in 2006, the Specter was definitely still good enough to get the job done, even if it was no longer as powerful as it once was. In 2006, Hypnotic Specter was played in the deck that won the World Championship. During its time in Standard, creatures had progressively become more pushed. I mean, by this point, people now had access to Tarmogoyf and Doron the Siege Tower, creatures that were absolutely massive for their cost. As a result, the Specter was now limited to a singleton copy. Just in its time in Standard, it managed to shift from being worth playing a full 4 of, to being a card that you put in your deck to round it out more than anything. And Hypnotic Specter was never able to see play in Standard again, despite a reprint in Magic 2010. By then, it had also stopped seeing play in Legacy, and it hasn't achieved a top 8 at any significant event since then. It's still legal in Legacy today, of course, alongside Dark Ritual, but powering it out in turn 1 with a Ritual just isn't what it once was. The Specter is way too easy to kill with very cheap removal, so you often end up 2-for-1ing yourself by running out the Specter on turn 1, and there are lots of 1 mana and 2 mana creatures that can attack through or block it with no problem at all. More recently, it got a Magic Arena only reprint in the very first Historic Anthology. This was a special set of cards printed that are only legal in Arena's Historic format, a format where almost every card on Arena is legal, and it's never done anything in that format either. So the question becomes, what happened exactly? Why isn't Hypnotic Specter good enough to see play these days? Well, we did see that in formats without Dark Ritual, the Specter was never quite as successful. But it isn't like it was never played in formats without the Ritual. After all, it made some serious noise in Standard between 2005 and 2007. But overall, creatures have become far more powerful over the years. This is where power creep is the most notable. We started to see that trend even in 2007, when cards like Tarmogoyf and Doron started to take up creature slots in decks because they were so insanely efficient. That trend has only continued to the point where we are today, where I'm fairly sure the Specter wouldn't even see play in Standard. If you're spending 3 mana now, your creature kinda needs to do something, even if it dies right away. In other words, you need an enter the battlefield ability, or a death trigger, or haste, or it has to be really hard to kill, and the Specter isn't any of those things, and it easily dies to lots of 1 mana removal throughout Standard. Now, if you spend 1 generic and 2 black on a creature in Standard, it needs to be something like Gix Yawgmoth Praetor. He's a 3 mana 3/3 with a text box filled with upside, including the potential to draw you a card the turn he comes down. There is one interesting comp to the Specter, a card that actually did see play in Standard a few years ago, Thief of Sanity. It has a similar mana cost and flying, and even the Specter creature type, and it does something when it hits your opponent. In this case, you get to nab a card from the top 3 of your opponent's library. While the effects are different, they are similar enough. Both of them claim a card when they hit the opponent. That said, while the Thief was successful in Standard about 4 years ago, I also have a hard time imagining it would get the job done in Standard today. So if Hypnotic Specter was printed 4 years ago, maybe it would have been good enough to see play, since Thief of Sanity did, but I now think we've reached the point where a formerly super powerful creature like the Specter wouldn't even see play in Standard. Now that we've heard the narrative of Hypnotic Specter's competitive history, let's take a look at the numbers. Between 1995 and 2008, Hypnotic Specter achieved 6 Worlds top 8s, including 2 wins, 5 Pro Tour top 8s, including 1 win, and 17 Regional or Grand Prix top 8s. So, Hypnotic Specter was really good from the mid-1990s through the mid-2000s, so good that Wizards of the Coast was afraid to reprint it and banned it out of Extended. However, by the end of the first decade of the 2000s, Hypnotic Specter became a victim of creature power creep, and ever since then, it's been too inefficient to find success at Magic's highest level of competition. So that's the history of Hypnotic Specter. If you want to get your hands on Hypnotic Specter or any other Magic cards, use my special Card Kingdom link in the description. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to learn more about Magic history, including in more videos that go deep on the competitive history of specific cards, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.